Dear friends and colleagues, hello, this is me, i.t.verstyuk, and I'm happy to greet you today. This is going to be another philosophical video post that I hope will be intellectually enriching for all of you. So today, when I opened the Financial Times web page, the first thing I read was that the Federal Reserve System of the United States raised its interest rate by half a percentage point. That was long overdue, since the inflation is on the rise and the central banks usually fight inflation with the rate hike. That's what Federal Reserve was supposed to do a little bit earlier, but did only now. Let me move on with this. The interest rate and its nature is about regulating the dynamic of money. Dynamic of money is a complicated thing. This is expansion of lending business on one side and expansion of price expectation on the other side. Dynamic of money is complicated philosophical theory. If you take 19th century philosophers who wrote about the economics, like Karl Marx, he did not have a proper understanding of what interest rates were. For Marx, interest rates were a tool for exploiting the workers. He didn't invest enough of his own time to research the nature of interest rates, though he was a reader of The Economist, a British magazine that was covering monetary policy extensively in the 19th century, thanks to Walter Bagehot, first editor, founding editor of The Economist. Dynamic of money is a philosophical theory that could be related somewhat to what Henri Bergson, 20th century philosopher, wrote in his book Creative Evolution. Creative evolution is another interesting philosophical theory which says basically, as long as the dynamic of any process goes forward, it reinforces itself and makes itself a forward-looking force. It makes itself completely practical thing. So when the dynamic of money goes on with this balance between inflation and interest rates, that's the nature of economic development. The economy doesn't exist as a system that just stands on its feet and doesn't move. Economy is like a rabbit that keeps on jumping all the time. And if you take every single moment, the rabbit is either jumping or preparing to jump. That's important. Economic development is a process that reinforces itself. Now let me make a turn in my intellectual discourse. Let me make a turn. Now we have a war in Ukraine. And as you might well know, better than myself, that money matters during the war. Money matters for both the invading army and the army that keeps its defensive operation. And now we have Russia who is invading and Ukraine does defense. Both armies need financial support. Both armies need supply of food, fuel, ammunition, weapons, guns, ammo, everything. So as soon as Russia runs out of money from their central bank reserves and finance ministry reserves and their wealth fund reserves, it's absolutely predictable that it will lose the war. Not because they're weaker in the battlefield, though they are, but because they will run out of money. And for soldiers, that's a complicated thing to explain. They would be asking their generals, where is their food? Where is our ammunition? Where is our fuel? And Russian generals won't have anything to say to those soldiers who went to fight the war. And they're getting paid like $1,000 a month. You can make much more if you're a Starbucks barista in New York City. But Russian soldiers don't read the news probably about the Starbucks salaries. Otherwise, they would go work in Starbucks. But they decided to come here to Ukraine, come to my country, and fight the war against civilians like myself. Unacceptable, totally unacceptable. And I'm not surprised. Most of the members of the United Nations condemned this war. Yeah, that's important. So we've got creative evolution. But there is also such a thing as creative destruction. That's another philosophical theory created by Joseph Schumpeter, who was a professor of Chernivtsi University in Western Ukraine, and later he moved on to teach at Harvard University. So now we have two interesting concepts: Henri Bergson's creative evolution on one side, and Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction on the other side. Both these men came up to their theories differently. Henri Bergson was mostly about philosophy of science, mathematics, nature. And Joseph Schumpeter, who even was Austrian finance minister for some time, was mostly thinking about interest rates, monetary policy, banking business, lending business, and bonds. And it's interesting, they're coming up to the same thing, which is nature of dynamic of any process, from different perspectives with different approaches: creative evolution and creative destruction. What's interesting is that when creative evolution goes in an improper way, in an incorrect way, it's met by creative destruction. If you research nature, biology, it tells you that creative evolution at some point does have creative destruction. Take dinosaurs. Those were products of creative evolution, but at some point, the whole ecosystem of dinosaurs destroyed itself from the inside. That's very interesting. So now take Russia. While experiencing large inflows of capital, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, when the oil prices were quite high and gas prices were quite high, Russia was going through its own creative evolution, gradually losing its freedom of speech, gradually losing freedom to disagree with the Kremlin, but it still was creative evolution, and Moscow and Petersburg had their middle-class population growing. But at some point, Russian creative evolution got stuck. Inflow of capital stopped because no one believed Russia was having right market economy and right business environment to earn money, to earn return on your capital. And that's when the creative destruction started. But instead of living through its own creative destruction, like prescribed by Schumpeter, former finance minister of Austria and Chernivtsi professor, instead of living through own creative destruction, Russia decided to export this destruction to a neighboring country, where I live, to Ukraine. And so what we have, Ukraine has been on the path of its own creative evolution since 1991, when it gained its independence from the Soviet Union. Russia was going through own creative evolution. But then, when Russia moved to the stage of creative destruction, It refused to accept destruction as a positive force. Instead of destructing the Putin regime, which is politically unsustainable, Russians decided to invade Ukraine, to bring the energy of destruction here. But they were met by the Ukrainian army. And now both countries have their own creative destruction. Russia has aggressive destruction, and Ukraine is destructed by Russian aggression. Like the economy is ruined pretty much, unemployment is on the rise, some people feel hopeless, though that's emotional thing. Mostly Ukrainians do have solidarity and have their hopes with the Ukrainian army, who will defeat the invaders at some point. It might not be easy, it might not be soon, but it will eventually happen. I have no doubts about that. So let me conclude. There are two big historical processes to understand the nature of change, from my point of view. One process is biological evolution, which is interesting. Another process is money and economy and economic development. Both tell us the same thing. There is creative evolution and there is creative destruction. So let's hope that forces of good will prevail over forces of evil. Creative evolution will win, and it will take as much of necessary changes from creative destruction as needed for all the processes that rule this war to become better.